Good morning. It's the last day at the Jaipur Literature Festival. The crowds are behind us. The weekend is over. We're already breathing a little lightly. And what better way than to dive deep into the ideas of how stories travel? In the way that many of you have traveled to come out here, absorb the culture and tradition and craft practices and everything that we see around us, plus the amazing built heritage that Jaipur has to offer. We want to look at why museums today are relevant, if at all, in the age of the super internet, AI, Grok, and everything, and Google Arts, where you can actually go online and check out museum collections. Do we actually still need to go to museums? Is there another model? And the importance of museums to record history, or the way governments perhaps want history to be known in new narratives. We have an amazing panel here, so I'm going to start pretty much with Debra in no real order. Debra, the Smithsonian is, the place that we all go to. Anybody who goes to America, certainly Washington, it's a must-go-to place. And I don't have the statistics of how many people from India travel to Washington and therefore go to the Smithsonian, but I suspect it's a very, very large number. Certainly more than the Indians who go to any museum here in India. Let me ask you, the Smithsonian is not just one museum. I think it's 16 or 17 or 18 museums, including the Museums of Africa or the Africa History Museum, whatever it's called. Tell us a little bit about the background of the Smithsonian. How did it begin? And what its relevance is today in the telling of not just the history of the world, but the history of America itself.
Thank you for that setup of a question. I hope everyone can hear me. So I work for the Smithsonian, which has 19
So just hold it a little closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I work for the Smithsonian, which is the American National Museum, which has 19 museums and research centers. The most visited is Air and Space, certainly by our visitors that come from the subcontinent. But we also have an astrophysics observatory, and in Panama, an ecological center. So it's really pretty vast. And I'm always finding out more about it because it's huge and unwieldy. It's got some bit of government funding. So for example, my museum, which is the Asian Museum, which is the very first art museum of the Smithsonian from one of the moments when we had a global outlook.
How many of you have been to any of the Smithsonian Museum? How many of you have been to the Asian Art Museum in the Smithsonian? How many of you went to the Julia Child exposition or exhibition at the Smithsonian, which I certainly went to, and I just loved the fact that they recreated the kitchen. But go ahead, Sonya.
And you asked me what are the challenges or how are we going to tell the story of America right now? I don't know. We're in a period of flux, shall we say. Our 250th anniversary, which is much younger than the city of Jaipur. Our 250th anniversary is coming up, and for the first time, we're looking at possible governmental interference in what we do. So check with me next year.
How many of you have been to the Museum of, what's it called, Museum of Africa or Museum of?
There's African and African American.
African American, sorry, African American. What's the museum called? African American.
Well, we're governmental, so everything is an acronym, NAMAC, National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Is the narrative there something that's being challenged?
Is the narrative there something that's been challenged? If any of you haven't been to this museum, I highly recommend it.
It's amazing.
It's extraordinary
Totally
and beautiful.
spectacular.
And it begins in the basement with the story of slavery to the Americas. It talks about race as a social construct. It works its way through the civil rights and then ends with kind of the contributions of African Americans to American civilization. Will that be under attack? Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, there seems to be a white nationalist moment, but the secretary, the head of the Smithsonian is called the Secretary Lonnie Bunch. He was a curator at Nimock. He's now running the Smithsonian, and he's been a great and inspiring leader in this moment when we have a challenge. And I don't know how the challenge will affect me as a curator of South Asian and Himalayan art, although I have been told, I did read on the government website that I was applying woke ideology to traditional Indian values. So like I said, stay tuned. But we think we can do it. We think we can keep history, proper history, diverse stories there. We just have to be very careful so that we don't immediately irritate our right wing. And maybe we didn't do a good enough job in the past because a lot of Americans feel excluded from the national story, white Americans feel excluded from the national story. So right now we think we can do it. Next year, invite me back, we'll discuss it again.
Pramod, Debra talked about a lot of white Americans feeling excluded from the story that's being told. In India today, we have about 700 museums. Have any of you been to, say, 10? 10 museums? That's pretty good. Anybody been to 20 museums in the country? Okay. 30? No. Oh, 30. Rima's been to at least 100 museums. So, yeah, because of her research. What is it that we've done wrong, Pramod? And you've done so many amazing museums, including, there's two wonderful museums in and around Jaipur. One is in Curator, where he displayed the writings. How many volumes? 30,000 volumes, 7,000 volumes?
Writings over 41 years.
Over 41 years, which is displayed there. And for some of you may have gone to the Amrapali Museum, which displays silver and jewelry from the Amrapali collection, which is again fabulous and tells the story or whatever. But what is it that we've done wrong, perhaps, in terms of museum professionals like you, where we haven't been able to tell a story that pushes back on the idea that everybody is now pushing back on? The liberal or the left of the center, we've obviously failed telling our stories because both in America and in Europe and here in India, we're now the minority and we're being seen as woke, this liberal lot, etc. What have we done wrong in our storytelling?
So, the idea of the museum itself is a colonial construct. It's not something that was natively or indigenous to us as a country or a civilization. But what's really interesting is that we seem to have adopted that format post-independence into a nationalist project where you have to build a story around the nation and its greatness. But the one simple problem that I feel conscious every time I'm in a museum within India or representing any part of India is who are the people that we've forgotten? What are the marginalized communities who are not represented there at all? Because museums have always been about objects. And if you don't have objects of indigenous communities, from Dalit communities, which are not considered aesthetic or high art, they just don't exist in these collections. So that is a huge mass of people who are completely ignored and not seen. So the great and the good are constantly referred to, but the ordinary Indian story is not always there. And worse off is if you're away from the bigger centers of power. So geographies have changed, democratic institutions have come in, but those who are ignored continue to be ignored. And so that has been one major failure. The other major drawback, I would say, is that...
So, Pramod, let me hold you on that. Any of you been to the Bhopal Tribal Art Museum? Anybody? It is India's best museum. And in terms of those people who are ignored, that's a place to go to if you want to look at least Madhya Pradesh traditions of tribal art from each of their tribal spaces. An absolute must visit on your bucket list, and Bhimbetka.
And the advantage of what he just mentioned on Bhopal is that the tribal museum there was not curated by curators. It was put together by community elders who were brought in to tell the story of each of these indigenous communities in their own way. So it is a viewing of their world, not necessarily of objects. So that idea of being able to put a lived culture with its objects and provide the 360-degree context is really what is important. And hence I feel that the way forward for us is likely to be, what are the multiple filters? In 2026, I cannot look at a bottle and say it is made of plastic and it's got a red cap. There has to be much more to it. I have to be able to tell the multiple histories of what it contains, who made it, what are the links to other parts of the world, what materials came from elsewhere, and who used it eventually. So multiple context is really what we are now looking to see represented adequately in museums, sometimes through objects, but a lot through technological interfaces also, immersive experiences that we constantly speak about. It is this layered history that is hopefully allow the viewer to take back something more concrete.
Pramod, much of the work that you've been doing is in private museums. Amrapali is private, Curator is private. I think there's about 175 private museums today across the country, with the largest concentration actually in Bangalore and Bombay, and now Gurgaon for some reason, including the Museo Camera, which is a public-private partnership, the Museum of Transportation, which is also in Gurgaon. Is this a possible way forward, where you do not depend on governments, pretty much like the Americas, where you don't necessarily depend on government funding who want to tell a particular kind of story, which of course they must because that's their duty. But is there a need and a space and a way that we can have much more private museums or private public partnership museums?
Yes, for sure. The advantage of private museums and public-private partnerships is that there is not one single agenda. It is usually the agenda of the collector alone. So they're collecting philosophy. Why were they collecting? What were they collecting? That gets told very clearly. Whereas, as Sanjoy correctly said, the national agenda is what comes with the government. That's a mandate. They have to tell the larger story of the country, the civilization, the subcontinent. Whereas individual collectors tell the story of the objects in their collection and what it means to them. And I feel a layer of all of these kinds of museums together is really what will make our experience of the museum landscape of India much better, because there is no one universal civilizational encyclopedic museum that exists in India. There may be one built in the future for sure, but as of now that simply does not exist. And these layers of private museums, public museums, private and public, collaborative museums, cultural archives coming forward, all of these are really the way forward for us to be able to understand where we are at 2026. You know, it's important to realize that post-independence, the mandate of showcasing was different, looking at it now, and the terminology, and this is a common example most of our colleagues speak about. When we were studying in school, textbooks said the revolt of 1857. Today we are very clear that we say the uprising of 1857 or the second uprising or the first war of Indian independence, whichever way. So how has the terminology alone allowed you to decolonize the museum? That itself is, so every act of a label, a caption, a tombstone information, a text panel, an object, a perspective allows you to look at things differently.
And staying with the idea of collections, you know, we've always looked at the Americas and Europe as having collectors who then bequeathed their fairly large collections into museums, etc. This now has started in India. I mean, Lekha Poddar, Kiran Nadar Foundation, Sunil Munjal, the Museum of Music in Bangalore, the Camera Museum, Are you seeing this as something that people are becoming aware and that they want legacy? I remember asking Sangeeta Jindal, you know, of a fairly wealthy group of companies. I said, Sangeeta, when will you look at a legacy museum? And she said, Sanjoy, we're all first time sort of coming into this space. Forget legacy. I want to do something for myself now. But now she started thinking of legacy with the Children's Museum and their own space. Do you see this to be perhaps the future of the museum space here in India?
Yes, absolutely. The future of the museum space in India is going to be a lot of legacy projects. Just to be warned, there may be a few vanity projects within that, but that's small and minor. The larger issue is legacy projects. Do also remember that frequently when collectors collect, they buy because of an abiding interest in the domain. the area that they like, be it paintings or textiles. They're also conscious that as they turn older, their next generation may not be interested in continuing that pursuit. And that also makes them feel that how do we safeguard what we've put together? So it makes sense to create an institution where these objects go together as a group, as against getting fragmented. On the flip side, if they do get fragmented, other collectors get a chance of acquiring things that go into other collections. So there is no easy answer, but yes, a lot of legacy building is most definitely happening, and the public can only welcome it because we get an opportunity to see treasures that we've always heard about or been told exist, but never really got an opportunity to see them.
Sonya, you know, what was fascinating for me when I went to your museum many years ago was there in Ohio, in many ways, it wasn't necessarily a place that you had Asians streaming through to see your collection. It was a place that you had mostly white Americans coming to familiarize themselves or see something that was exotic or not familiar. What was the role of your particular department and your particular collection in this larger idea of the Cleveland Art Museum? And set us a context of where the museum sits, its 44,000 objects, and how does it play itself in the politics of the local area?
So the Cleveland Museum of Art prides itself on not collecting collections and instead being well enough funded and also being staffed with directors and curators who are extremely knowledgeable and are leaders in their fields, and so that they are able to identify the finest example of its kind to represent key moments throughout world history. So it's a museum that calls itself a comprehensive, if not exactly encyclopedic museum, with a collection that spans the world and most of all of time, but it's not a collection that's particularly large. So with regard to the art of South Asia, actually in terms of the museum just reopened in 2012, and the Indian and Southeast Asian galleries are some of the prime galleries in the entire institution. And so there's a great deal of pride for the Asian collections as a whole, especially also including India and Southeast Asia. So there is a sense of civic pride in Ohio.
And China.
And China, yes.
I mean, some of the Buddha collections from China are extraordinary at the Cleveland Art Museum.
Right. So the Chinese collections and the Indian and Southeast Asian collections are understood worldwide as some of the best in the world. And this is mostly because the director, Sherman Lee, who started as a curator in 1952 and was director until 1983, he had been a monuments man during World War II in Asia, and so had a great deal of knowledge about the arts of Asia. But also, it was at that time that they received a huge endowment of $70 million for acquisitions of art. And it was a time when a great deal of some of the best art was coming out of India. And Sherman Lee was working with Shiva Ramamurthy, who was the director of the National Museum, who had a project to make sure that Indian art was represented on an equal level as art from anywhere else in the world. And so therefore to prove sort of the worthiness of the new nation to exist using cultural elements. And so they very much wanted to show Indian art as some of the finest quality aesthetic works of fine art on a pedestal, beautifully lit, the best aesthetic examples of their kind. But what happened was that a lot of their contexts and stories were therefore stripped of their stories, their provenance histories and usages.
So one of the big issues, obviously, that we're seeing more and more is what's the provenance of a piece of art, especially sculpture or antiquity, that lands up in museums. Mostly, of course, it started with the British Museum and the V&A, and then as we continue to look at it, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Houston Museum, and of course the Cleveland Museum. How do we address this? Because today there's a demand that many of these things that are not with proven its history of how it got there. There's this effort, can it be sent back? How do you send back the marble from Athens, or how do you send back some of the sculptures from here? Is there a way? Is there a long loan? Is there a reason why it needs to be sent back? Can it be studied there in a much more fundamental way? Does art need to be shared, or does it have to be part of a tribal tradition of this is mine and it needs to belong to me?
I think the important element that is often missing is in-depth research and sharing of information. So what we need are more researchers who are able to find the histories, understand the context. Most of the time, objects in museums we don't even know exactly the site from which they came. And if we do, we don't know where at that site it came from and how it functioned there. So once that can be uncovered, and the mechanisms for the transfer of pieces from one place to another, honestly, the information is shared among all the interested parties in both countries and source nations, the answer usually becomes quite clear what should happen to the object. What is the best place for it? Also, when local communities are able to receive education about the history of the piece, the importance on a global art historical context of value as well, local communities then understand the pride that they would like to have it in a museum, perhaps. But I think the conversations have to take place with enough information and education on all sides. And then the answer there's usually no argument.
Education and information on all sides. Debra, one of the things that a lot of the museums in America do, or in most parts of the world do, is now focus on education and look at the research. A, what is your view on this, on the whole idea of reparations? Two, is art there to be shared globally? How does this new technology where everything is online solve some of that problem? And tell us a little bit about the education program that you all have.
I'm going to try and tie together the provenance and the education question. So the Smithsonian has had the strictest provenance requirements of any museum in the United States. But I've worked there for 25 years, and we keep changing them and making them more strict as we find out more about the history of objects that were stolen or looted. So what we've done is actually shift a lot of our attention, and I feel like I can say this for Cleveland as well. Repatriation is part of what we do, but we use it as opportunities to create closer relationships with other countries. So we repatriate an object, we create an educational program or a training program there. We borrow objects back. So it's made us a more open institution in that way. And I'm in charge of South and Southeast Asia, so that's where my repatriations have gone. The Smithsonian's huge on education. It's actually kind of core to our mission. So we do many things digitally, more and more digitally, and more training programs overseas.
Pramod, what fascinated me, a lot of the objects that go out from India are religious iconography, as you know, statues and the Buddhas and the Ganeshas and the Saraswatis or the doorkeepers or the Dwarpalas that people think are Saraswatis. What was fascinating to me when I went to the British Museum, or maybe V&A, or I can't remember which of them, they have a thorn of Christ, supposedly from his crown, but it sits in a general, glass space there, and people walk past it, and those who read the indent know that it's the thorn from the supposed crown of Christ. Yet another thorn finds itself in a church where you have a pilgrimage through the year going through. How do we sort of make this differentiation when you take a piece of religious iconography, put it into a museum? Does it lose its place, space, and its energy?
So while I can't speak necessarily for energy, because I really feel that is an experience you have when you communion with the object in front of you, be it in a temple or in a museum. What really happens, at least in Hindu, Buddhist, and to some extent other Indic cultures, is that the object within a temple is not just a sole act of worship in the shrine, but it goes with a lot of rites and rituals that are performed along with it. That sort of makes it auspicious, right, and a forum where this worship, two-way transaction can happen. You look at the object sees you, all of that happens. The moment it's put into a museum, all of that, the flowers, the holy water, everything is removed. You only have the sacrosanct object. Then the object is just an object. It's not really a religious object as such. So even in many temples, when an idol breaks or something happens and it's replaced, the khandit, the energy, as you asked about, is taken out of the object, put into the new one, and the old one is discarded, because then it's only material. It's stone or wood or whatever it is. So in a lot of the objects we see in museums, traditionally, either if they were damaged or broken or pillaged, they cease to retain ceremonial power anymore. And hence they are much more palatable. Having said this, there's a very famous story of a national museum in New Delhi where there was a fantastic Ganesh statue which every morning had a fresh flower in front of it, because one of the cleaning staff, for them this was the Ishtadevta, and they would bring every day a fresh flower and put it there outside the case.
And also drank milk.
And all of it, I mean, all of it comes together.
On that particular milk drinking occasion, this particular statue drank
have
milk.
a lot of, so people's cultural context tends to vary. So you may have something in a glass case which somebody who's a little more honed into the cultural aspect knows that this is now devoid and desanctified, whereas something similar within a shrine plays a much larger context and is thus considered holy or sacred.
Sonya, there's an argument, of course, you have these huge big museums like the Cleveland, Smithsonian, our national museums, etc. Is there today an argument that you need to take the museum to the people rather than bring people to the museum? And how do we again go back to what Pramod KG said in terms of addressing those stories which have not been told, about communities, about people who've been, in many ways, their stories have been erased from history because they're seen not to count. What is the purpose of a museum today?
Well, a museum is a place that is a crucible for learning, and a place where there's a reason to uncover the stories and do that research. It's a tremendous amount of research and resources required to uncover the stories and the context, because we're talking about long, long ago, and the archives are difficult to access, multiple languages, etc. And so at least when there's a museum with a collection, the museum takes seriously the fact that this object is in its care. And therefore, we are responsible for uncovering the stories and disseminating the stories, because our mission is as a public institution, and to share the stories with the public in a full way. But what happens is once we get all of this information, one single object out of the 40,000 requires, a 500-page book and a whole exhibition unto itself. So this is what we did with the Krishna Govardhana exhibition, where it was one object recontextualized, and to bring it to the people, we can also create these digital experiences to allow people to not just read the story of the piece, but walk through it and experience it themselves. And this can then be on digital platforms that can be accessed by anyone. But also working with the relationships with source countries is to bring these stories back to the communities, because they themselves don't have the opportunity to access the museums in America or even in their capital cities. And so to come back to local communities and be able to disseminate that and make them take ownership of the sites and places from which objects have come, keep them safe. And pretty much where any monument is carefully and honestly engaged with the local community, where the community takes ownership of the monument, even if it's in ruins, looting doesn't happen. And so when communities can be themselves the caretakers of sites, we can then start to bring objects back. And we see this happening in Cambodia in places like Bante Chmar.
Community. So one of the things, Debra, that I find fascinating, and I've been doing some reading about. So pre-COVID, I've been seeing, when you read the statistics, you saw a decline in people going to physical activity as they continued to only do stuff online. And then COVID came, and that was it. Everybody was locked up, they baked bread, and they did social media, roughly. Post-COVID, have you seen this return to actually want a tactile, in-person relationship, be it with objects, with museums? And how is this playing out if it hasn't happened with museum finances? What is the new story around museum financing?
The Smithsonian is back after COVID. I mean, I can certainly say that the first time I came back to our museum after 2 years away, I wept because I had forgotten sort of how extraordinary was the materiality of a plate from Nishapur in 10th century Iran, all of that. And so our people are back, and the Smithsonian's quite obsessed almost with visitor surveys. So we have a pretty clear idea of why people come, and it's really different reasons. Some people come to connect with their heritage, other people come to connect with the rest of the world. Some people come for beauty, it's very peaceful. There's all sorts of different reasons and very different responses. School kids come because their teachers take them. But so I think that COVID blip has ended, but the focus of our museum is more towards digital, and that's not going to go away.
It's not going to go away.
No, because we're trying to make our collections especially available within Asia.
And how does that impact your funding? I mean, there was some amount of funding coming through as people came through. They could have donated, they could have bought tickets for special exhibitions. How does that impact the museum?
Our museum is free. Everything is free, and we're open every single day of the year except for Christmas. So that we didn't lose any money from the gate, but there's less money around in general, and so we have to be more wise about how we use it. And what I see happening across the world is fewer and fewer loan exhibitions, because moving an object is the most expensive thing that we do.
Pramod KG, museumology in India is the go-to thing now. Everybody wants to build museums. Last year, they spent $7.1 billion as an outlay for museums in India. Not entirely sure how that worked out. Today, there's an idea of moving the National Museum, re-looking at the collections, moving out everybody from North and South Block as they have been, and making that the National Museum of India. How do you see that playing out? Because you've been intricately associated with it for now.
So while I can't speak for the government for sure, the little understanding I've had is that the National Museum will continue as it is. There's going to be no change in that. The new museum, I'm told, is going to be a civilizational museum talking about the story of India as a civilizational entity, not just itself, but its relationship with the rest of the world. And so that is really what it is. And the contents, I'm assuming, will come from all the national museums across India, because the government of India has several museums, including about 50 plus museums owned by the Archaeology Survey of India. So all of that material will come together in this new South-North Block spaces, which will be animated with a civilizational story of India. So that's really where the intent is. As far as the money, I don't think the money is ever going to be enough in culture when you spend it on museums. Do remember, we are a very large country with archaeological sites and museums spread far and wide. Basic amenities you need in a museum getting 50,000 people is very similar to the amenities you need in a museum getting 500 people, right? You still need the washrooms, you need the locker rooms, you need the ticket counter, you need the basic services. So that kind of money will need to be spent to maintain sites. And also, what are the kind of trained curatorial teams who are going to come into the museums? Who are the people who are going to hopefully interpret and talk about these stories in languages and ways and means that are accessible to people? One of the things we consciously feel is that a lot of times people visit both from within big metro centers and from the hinterland are people who may or may not be able to read or write any language. They may be able to speak, but they may not be able to read or write any one language. So how can they also feel that they're part of it? Now, to tell those stories, a lot of funds is required to create immersive experiences, to create ways in which you can look at it. I'm not saying that you can do it inexpensively. You can, but you really need a larger ecosystem of professionals and people in the fraternity, trained people, museologists, as you started with, who are now being looked at as a serious profession across the country. We have a couple of institutions which are giving you postgraduate degrees, diplomas in museological sciences, and these people are now becoming part of teams with fantastic museums coming up, not just in the bigger centers, but across the larger landscape of cultural sites, site-interpretative museums, private museums that we already spoke about.
I'm going to open it up in a second, but Sonya, tell us, what's the policy about museums working with each other and sharing works? And how does that work, not just within America, within your area, but really across the world? Is there much more of an argument today in this whole, should we send it back, not send it back, to actually exchange and share objects? And how do you all do it at the Cleveland Museum?
No, this is going to be the way of the 21st Century Museum, is much more collaboration, especially with source countries. And what's happened with the system, I think, of where museum curators would go to an art fair or go to an art dealer and they'll see something they love and pick an object, buy it for the museum, is that it's been a very ad hoc kind of approach. And so we have just pieces of sets here and there scattered all over the world. So what we can do when we start to collaborate together is start to create collections in places that, with long-term loans, that can tell stories in galleries that make a lot more sense. And so this has been the case where we've worked a lot with Cambodia, where we just signed an MOU at the Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore, where we'll be borrowing works of modern and contemporary and indigenous art to have on view in Cleveland, and also sending objects to India, and also sending objects to Cambodia. And when giving objects to Cambodia, for instance, it has in turn allowed for the laying of plans for long-term loans of great objects that make much more sense together than otherwise would have been the case.
Let's take some questions from the audience, and then I'll come back and ask them about their one favorite object. I'll take them in clusters, so the 3 questions right in front. All 3, just give them a mic up in front. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come back. Go ahead.
Hi.
Ooh.
Hello. Hi, I'm Moira. I know your work very well, Debra. I'm with Zocalo Public Square, and we've worked for many years with the Smithsonian. One of the Smithsonian's efforts is the museums on Main Street that takes the collections off of the hill out into the public. Now that India is at this moment that Sanjoy has said, where we've invested $7 billion into this new burgeoning museum industry in India, what's your advice for taking this history and culture out of these buildings and out into the public? What are some of the things that the Smithsonian has done that you'd like to share with us?
So taking stuff, taking it out to the public. Who's the other one? Yep. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you so much. I'm born and raised in Cleveland, spent the last 8 years in DC, so a joy to hear from the people who shaped institutions that shaped me. My question is, I mean, both of you receive very different populations throughout the year. How do you keep the museums both accessible for first-time visitors who might not have any knowledge about South Asia, South Asian art, South Asian artifacts, but also keep it interesting for South Asians who come frequently, might be repeat visitors, might be looking for something new, and how do you balance those education efforts?
So accessible for first-time visitors, the lady in front.
Hi, I'm Neeru Saluja. My question is to Pramod. You were talking about people having their heirlooms and so on, and the children now have no value for it. So where is it that they can really give their stuff, which may just go to any kabadi wala?
So how do you give heirlooms to people? And the last question in front.
Second is, what about the mobile museums? Have you ever thought about mobile museums?
Mobile museums, okay. Where's the bells ringing from? Is it because we're in a museum session, or? Go for it.
Maybe this question can be answered by Sanjoy ji and Pramod ji. In India, at least, you see the defense, the army taking a big bite of setting up museums for showing their warfare or whatever. So how do you think this is going to play into the museum space? And it is said that Da Vinci had written the book and increased the footfall in not just Paris, but also Italy. So the two of you, do your museums also do something which the authors can write, and is there any more work that happens in that sphere?
Right. So, Debra, you go first with how do you take museums outside? What have you all done in your museum program for that?
Well, actually, India's been a great leader in mobile museums and sending things out in buses. So we do some of that. I think our big emphasis has been on making sure we have school buses to bring people in. We do a program with the Afghan teenage refugee
Debra,
community.
Mike.
Yeah, if we do a program with the Afghan teenage refugee community, it's usually about buses bringing them in.
And also at Cleveland,
we have a
yeah.
huge emphasis on, most of our visitors are first-time visitors because we're located in Washington, D.C. So we make stories. Each gallery has a story. And we recently did an exhibition of Udaipur paintings where the story was about, not only about mood and bhav and ras, but it was also about ecological history and water harvesting, showing how advanced, India was at a certain point and how we could rethink in the United States how we deal with resources. So usually we go for 2 stories so we can bring in new audiences. Sorry,
New
Sonya.
audiences.
Oh yes, we have something called Art to Go. So that there is actually part of the Cleveland Museum of Art collection is designated as touchable and movable, so that they have fewer conservation concerns. It's our education art collection. So it's a separate part of the collection that's intended to be part of it brought out to the atrium every Saturday so people can handle them and learn about them, or some of them taken in like these little suitcases to schools or out into communities in our Studio Go vans.
And what's also interesting, and I really should say this because both these wonderful ladies from incredible institutions are next to me, is that if I today want to put together a presentation of 50 objects of Indian history, it's easier for me to download from the Cleveland or from the Smithsonian's website than it is from any Indian institution's website. So that also tells you accessibility is very much in your mind. You think you're accessible, but you really are not. How do you allow this kind of material to go out? So different communities can come to you, but everybody cannot get to a museum all the time. So you really need to make your digital presence so much more interactive and fulfilling that that information and layers of data that comes along with it are made. I make use of these collections all the time when I'm working with an object from a particular period. So I'm sure that's the case with anybody else.
Did you want to answer the Army Museum question?
So the Army Museum questions are, the Army Museums are generally, a lot of them are regimental history museums. Most of them are created by different regiments within the Indian Army where they talk about their history of gallantry awards, the kind of battles that they have formed or fought in, and the mix of people and communities that populate that particular regiment. But also what's happened increasingly, if you're aware, is that many of the Army cantonments manage and hold large sections of historical sites which are not necessarily accessible and really need to be. A case in point constantly brought up is the Mughal fort at Allahabad, which is inside an army cantonment. It has some extraordinary Akbar and Jahangiri period structures, which we just don't have access to because it lies within the cantonment areas. So there is a space of a large number of museums being created by the army, but their mandate and their story is totally different from the mainstream. It's more their own histories that they're trying to put out. And from the Garhwal Rifles to the Kumaon Regiment to the Madras Regiment, the Rajputana Rifle,
61st Cavalry, for example.
Everybody has a museum interpreting their gallantry awards, their stories, and that is really what is put out in.
But it's still a minuscule. I know your question was different. So it's a minuscule amount that's spent on museums by the army or the armed forces today. Where the question comes in is the museums that are being built on mythology as museums representing history. So whereas the museum in Kurukshetra, for example, and perhaps you're referring to that, where many millions of dollars have been spent to make mythology the truth. So how do you view that? I think in all of this, creating museums is a larger issue in terms of narrative and storytelling. Is it a bad thing or a good thing? I think the jury is out on that. Should we have more museums? Absolutely. Should museums be accessible in the way that Red Fort has now been vacated by the army, or in Amritsar, Gobind Fort has been vacated by the army? Daulatabad, to some extent, has been, but that's still work in progress. So I think there's a combination of all of this that needs to be done. But I really believe that the way forward is not necessarily to be dependent on governments to do stuff. Communities need to come together to tell their story. The saddest thing about India, certainly, is that we do not have a national museum to independence, and the story of independence. And it took Kishwar to create the first museum of independence or partition in Amritsar. We were involved in a whole thing of creating a museum for independence, but the politics behind that got so complicated, and the money story got so complicated. This was during the Congress regime, that I certainly ran for cover, and I said, this is not something that I'm willing to be party to, because you can't be setting up a museum to independence and to partition and have other considerations built into that, which has nothing to do with the story waiting to be told. And that was really a money issue where I pushed back on whatever I was asked to do. A couple of questions here, one from the back, very quickly. Yeah, she's got her hand up. And then one in front, and then we run out of time. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Debra. I just want to ask you, how particular is the Smithsonian about its sources of funding?
Particular sources of funding, it's a big issue. Yeah, we know that. One in front. A British museum, as you know, has been in a lot of trouble taking shell money. Not that they stopped, but yeah.
Hello. This is an India-specific question, very close to my heart. I've been observing it over the years. So when we were growing up, in whatever city we used to travel, we would seek out the art galleries as well as museums in the city. And at that time, I felt the experiences were similar. But as of probably the past 6 to 7 years, I've seen that art galleries have become so much more modern. Even if I'm visiting NGMA, let's say 3 times a month, I can attend different exhibits. Some days they have a slam poetry integration going on, some other VR integration. So every time you go, it feels new. But in my limited experience, when we go to museums, it seems more repetitive and less fun. If you go 3 times a month, it seems it's the same thing.
So it's the sameness. Can we do something to change the sameness? Who wants to take that? Oh, museum funding.
Oh.
How particular is the Smithsonian about the source of the money? So Sackler money, for example, in your particular case, how particular is that?
The Smithsonian publishes all of its funding, so nothing is hidden. Our building and our original collection of half of our museum comes from Arthur Sackler, who, although he died 7 years before OxyContin was invented, has had a horrible role, right, in like big pharma abuses during his life. So we don't take any money from the Sacklers anymore. And we've returned our Sackler objects. It was quite painful. They had some lovely Indian paintings. And we've returned our Sackler objects. 38% of our funding comes from the US government, which takes care of the physical structure and some of our salaries. And the rest are private and foundations.
Pramod, did you want to take?
Yeah, on the question of the nimbleness of museums as against galleries. Galleries generally have a board and a structure which allows them to change things very fast. They can be topical, they can acclimatize themselves, and they're showing based on what's topical at that time. Whereas museums have such larger, cumbersome processes that they need to go through. And also remember, museum objects are of a different kind and variety. So the care that is needed to take care of them, the display conditions, the ambient weather in which it can be shown, the cost of insurance of bringing it out of storage, putting it into public, are so much more that I think museums in India particularly have a longer way to go before we can be as nimble and flexible in showcasing and making newness in a gallery happen all the time.
And innovative. I would love to have continued this, asked them about their favorite objects. Sadly, we've run out of time. Debra and I have back-to-back sessions. Debra Diamond, Pramod KG, Sonya, thank you so much for this absolutely riveting session. Thank you.